Started, everybody. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. I'm really, really excited about this particular piece of research I did. Just as a quick disclaimer, I'm going to get into who I am, but this work was performed by myself and Richard Hilgers. Richard's not here. He's at Purdue, but we did this as a joint effort. It's just I'm presenting it, so that's kind of what that is. It's black box FISMA-based security control assessment of cloud providers, and essentially what we're going to be talking about today is when you move to the cloud, you give up a certain amount of security visibility. And I did a full analysis and research on how much of that visibility you lose and how much you can retain and how you would retain it, and that's what I'm presenting today. Okay, so a quick little who am I seems to be the thing. Currently I'm employed as a senior information security analyst. Welcome. At the Medical University of South Carolina. Before that I worked at Booz Allen doing NIST-based FISMA work for the National Science Foundation. I'm wrapping up my second of 5 years, so about to enter my third year of a doctoral program at Dakota State University in cybersecurity. It's wicked awesome. If anyone wants to talk about that afterwards, I'd love to talk about it. My research focus for my dissertation is going to be lightweight functional cybersecurity frameworks for small businesses. It's a huge gap for multiple reasons, but that's not the point of this talk. I have a wife and 2 kids, which makes me a husband and a father, and I'm very, very proud of that. And after this, if anyone wants to get a beer, I'm also down for that, because I love craft beer. Big old fan. So thank you. All right, so, because I don't want you guys waiting in trepidation for, like, what are the results going to be? I just want to present it up front, and then I'll deep dive into, how I got there, or how we got there and whatnot. So basically all federal agencies right now are having to look at cloud, and we'll explain why in a minute. But there's a lot of research around cloud security because it's fairly new. I'd say like in the last 5 or 6 years, it's kind of taken hold and it's being forced. The research that we use leverages well-documented standards. This is basically NIST. I know you mentioned that you're working in this space already. Like NIST is basically what it is. They're defining what the security controls. What we're going to see today is that basically when you move up into the cloud for your IT, you are only going to be able to have 9% visibility of the security controls. So you actually lose 91% of the visibility of the NIST minimum security requirements. Also, I should note, we used a moderate security baseline as our standard. It seems, to be like the standard. No one wants to go high because it's like too many controls, and no one wants to say low because that would mean that their system's not important. So
AWS just went FISMA high.
Who did?
AWS did.
Yeah. Well, they support it. It's just like as a PO, like no one wants to say high because then you have to add additional control. I mean, it's a political thing. Yeah. So 9% of the controls you have, and then 27%. We went one layer lower and actually looked at like control objectives. So, and we'll get into this in a second, but controls are broken up into multiple objectives. So if we were able to determine that one objective or 2 objectives out of, say, in the collection of 5 objectives were accessible, we captured that as well, just to kind of understand if you could get pieces of a certain control. So we're going to find that 27% of those controls are visible. So the key takeaway, if you walk away from this talk with one thing, it's that moving to the cloud has a real situational awareness cost associated with it to like what the security of your program really is. Okay, lit review, a bit of a background for those who are not familiar with it. I know there's a lot of us here that are, but I want to address this piece. So 2002, FISMA gets passed by W, and it's the Federal Information Security Management Act. And basically what it is it's a law that says all federal agencies have to have a minimum security standard applied to their IT systems. It's huge, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to take time. Congress, or FISMA through Congress, empowers NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to come up with what these standards are, what this information security is going to look like for these federal IT programs. This is 2005. Cloud's not really big yet. You got these huge data centers. They got their own. Everybody's got their own IT, and it's not a big deal. And this keeps on trucking, and that's fine. Well, in 2010, cloud's starting to come on the scene, and Vivek Kundra, who was the first U.S. Federal Chief Information Officer with a consortium conceived the idea of FedRAMP. And FedRAMP is basically kind of like a clearinghouse for cloud service providers to engage with federal agencies. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the idea of a approved cloud service provider grouping is what FedRAMP is. Vivek then goes on and issues in 2011 the Cloud First policy. It's got like a really long bureaucratic name, but people call it the Cloud First policy. And basically what this policy dictates is that any federal IT program is required to first evaluate a cloud service provider before they're allowed to spend funds building an in-house solution. So you're going to stand up a new program for the Marine Corps or something like that. Before you can just go buy hardware and mount the server racks up and get going, you have to demonstrate that you considered a cloud solution first. And I mean, obviously, you can get around that. You could say, oh, it doesn't work or whatever. But like, the idea is that the government is now dictating that cloud is going to be seriously considered. 2011, FedRAMP gets some teeth. They define a policy. This is how it's going to work. So in 2010, they're just coming up with an idea. They're talking about how it's going to work. 2011, they actually state the policy. And in 2012, they actually launched FedRAMP. And this is under the second federal CIO. I forget his name. But they launch it. And now it's like it's a clearinghouse. Cloud service providers are being evaluated against criteria. Federal agencies can go to FedRAMP and basically shop for cloud service providers. It's really an interesting and worthwhile endeavor. 2017, so this is based on, I pulled this yesterday, FedRAMP's projections for next year. They're expecting to have 750 ATOs, which are authority to operate. They're going to be offering 150 cloud services that federal agencies can shop. And then, this is really interesting, anyone who's worked in the federal IT space, they are basically declaring that from the moment that you show up to the moment that you have a provisional authority to operate, it should take 6 months. So this is huge. Like usually an ATO is 2 years, and like you almost never get it. You get an interim ATO, or you just field it and just hope for the best. So that's kind of like what's going on. The deal is cloud is being widely adopted by the federal government, okay? But I'm going to be talking about what the risk is there associated with it. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, this is the simple quote-unquote FISMA process. It's a 6-step process. Step 1 takes just a minute. You categorize what's in there. Step 2, you select your controls. Step 3, you implement your controls. Now, this is why the FedRAMP and going cloud is such a benefit and time saving and cost savings, because we'll use Amazon for an example. AWS has already implemented the controls. We said earlier that step 2, everybody's using moderate for the most part. Step 3 is you're implementing the controls. Well, Amazon's already done it for you. You have to do some in-house for yourself, but the IT infrastructure is already done for you by Amazon. And the assessment piece, which takes, that's 4 months probably to have an audit team come in and all that stuff. So Amazon's already done that. And then the authorization, that provisional ATO that we just talked about from start to 6 months, that's what's happening there. And then the monitor is just, continuous monitoring, standard order of business. So this is the overall process. I will note, step 4, where you're assessing and you're having that audit and you're having that visibility, this is where you're losing it by adopting the cloud. Because you can't audit, you can't scan, you can't go look at AWS inside. Okay, so this is the problem statement. And I should have backed this up one step. This problem, this issue was brought to me last year while in capacity of Dakota State University by a federal agency that said, hey, we want to go cloud, but we don't know what kind of security risk there is. Like, do you want to take this on as a research project? And that's why I worked with the fellow from Purdue on it, because it was an academic thing. So as you can see at the top, this is slide A and B. On the top, this is what the current traditional thing is. So this represents our agency. So in a classic situation, you build your own IT infrastructure, right? You select your controls, you apply the controls with your own personnel on your own IT, you assess it yourself, and then you get your authority to operate and you use it. So you have complete control over it. In the FedRAMP world, what happens is you take advantage of AWS, for example. For AWS to get that provisional ATO, FedRAMP authorizes a third-party organization. So it could be anyone. It could be Booz Allen. It could be Joe's Consulting. It doesn't. I mean, you have to be accredited to be able to do it. There's a process for that. But basically, some third party that's unrelated to the federal government or the agency that's getting it assesses it and says it's good to go, and that's how they get the ATO. So basically, the federal agency just goes ahead and starts using it. But they have no visibility into that security. So what we've done here is basically the slide that was just on the bottom, let's just push the top now. What we've done here is this yellow arrow is the result of the work. It's that 9% for the total controls, 27% for the partial controls. They can give some security visibility. So kind of a layout of the before and the after, if you will. Okay. Just some common language as I start using the terms when I talk about the research results. This is an excerpt from NIST 853 Rev 4. NIST 853 is a security control catalog. It's just a list of controls. Based on what your baseline is, it tells you what controls you need. This is PE18. It's a physical control. This element right here in green is the control itself. They are required to implement this for a moderate baseline. This element right here is a control enhancement. It speaks directly to this control, but for this research, we counted this as a separate control because it is possible, even though it enhances this, it is possible for this control to be in place and this control not to be in place. So we didn't want to lose visibility over that. So there's 161 total controls, and there's 164 control enhancements for a security moderate baseline, so 325 controls. So use the term control loosely because it includes control enhancements as well. Just for the taxonomy of NIST 853, there's 18 control families. Within each control, there are, it depends on the family, but there are a group of controls with enhancements. And then for each control, there are sub-objectives, and that's how you assess the control itself. Hopefully this is clear and not muddy. So I just want to define this because we're going to get into this. So, okay, so the method, the procedure with which we did this research, we used an exploratory approach. So, I mean, we dug in, we got, a super Excel document with like 3,200 rows, basically every assessment objective, and we went through them, line by line effectively. We did make some, we used 853A Rev 4, which is the companion document to 853, which basically defines how the controls are going to be assessed. So it's like it's a common approach to assessing the controls. Okay, so the idea behind choosing that is it's not me just coming up with a way to test it. It's a well-defined way. That way, if someone else wanted to repeat this research or dispute it, we'd have something to base it off of. There were, so there's 3,200 rows, right? But there's at the beginning, instead of going through everyone line by line, we tried to make some intelligent decisions right up front to filter out a lot of that noise. So in 853 Rev 3, if you're familiar with that, the controls were actually grouped categorically by managerial, technical, or administrative. They've taken it out in Rev 4, but the idea behind it still applies. So we went through and looked at all the managerial controls and just removed them right away because there's no way you can test it. A managerial control, for example, would be that there's a line item budget for information security in the annual financials for the program, right? Like we're not going to, there's no way from an end user perspective, I don't know if I said this at the beginning, the whole point of this is what can you look at from the outside of a cloud service provider that you can test. So managerial controls, you're not going to be able to test. You're not going to be able to know if they are doing end user awareness training. Like you're just not going to be able to know that. Administrative controls are, is it administrative and managerial? Those are almost the same. I guess I meant more operational controls there, where are they reviewing audit logs weekly? If there's if someone gets terminated, do they collect the laptop or the keys or disable their account? Like you can't test those things. So we were able to quickly eliminate, let's say, 2/3 of the controls right away. Then we took those technical controls that were outstanding. We went through one at a time using 853A Rev 4 as the assessment procedure and said, like, based on this assessment procedure, is it possible to test this control external to the cloud service provider? And if it was yes, then we captured it. And if it was no, we captured it as such. Okay, so this corresponds to what I said in the executive summary. 30 controls we found to be completely accessible. 89 controls we found to be partially accessible. And this is inclusive. So this 89 includes this 30 because if it's partially accessible. If it's completely accessible, then it's partially accessible. These are the 18 control families that I had mentioned. I've got some fancy graphics right here. These light blue ones you'll see, these are control families and their associated controls. Column CT is complete control count for that control family. CA is completely accessible. PA is partially accessible. You'll note that these control families that are highlighted have no completely accessible, no partially accessible. So, and it makes sense, right? Awareness and training. There's no way to test whether or not they're doing awareness training. Personnel security. This is around terminations and background screenings, and things like that. You can't test that. Planning and system and service acquisition. Are they working with their vendors to ensure that they're receiving administrative documentation? We can't test that from the outside.
You can't test it, but how about the documentation just being in place?
Yeah, I mean, how would you test that though? I mean, you can't.
Is it because you're looking at black box? So
yeah, I mean, you're sitting at like Starbucks, right? But you know, it's your your program is using Amazon AWS. What controls could you test? Like, granted, it is a control that they do have the documentation, but I mean, I guess you could pick up a phone and call and say, hey, like, I'm just curious, do you have documentation? They could tell you yes or no. You wouldn't be able to say with confidence whether the person's telling you the truth or not. And then B, I don't know if they would tell you. They might want to say, who are you? And
Okay, so this was a totally external. You guys didn't talk to anyone at AWS.
Correct. Yeah. And that was the problem statement positioned by the 3-letter agency that came to us with the problem. They said, we're going to go cloud, but we want to know what we can continue to check. Like, basically, they're paranoid, and they didn't want to just take it at face value that AWS is going to implement their controls.
Sure, but wouldn't they want to visit that site in person?
Yep. Sure. So, great point. When I said earlier that I kind of categorically broke it out by administrative, managerial, and technical, there was a fourth field that wasn't in Rev 3, but we found it to be obvious. Which was physical security controls. So we did make the assumption that as a consumer of AWS services, that it would be reasonable that you could request a site visit and that you would be granted that. So you could walk around and you could verify that there's fire extinguishers and that there's lock cages and that they check badges and stuff like that. You can't make that assumption?
No. So as somebody who has access, I have access to all of Amazon's proprietary data.
Okay.
Under FedRAMP and I have their packages and everything. So
yep.
I can see their full SSP in every bit of detail.
Right.
They still won't tell me where my data center actually is.
Uh-huh.
And part of my assessment package has been like, hey, where are these things located? They'll tell me the controls around them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to say, where, could I go to this data center? They won't even give me an address.
Interesting.
They will not do it. And I have full access to their full proprietary.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. That was an assumption we made. I guess that the logic was that, like Director Comey could be like, hey, I want to see it, or give this guy a walkthrough.
At that level probably could get that access.
Yeah, but I mean, we just made an assumption that you could request it and you would be granted, because the idea was that like they're trying to sell their services, so it's not an unrealistic request to have a walkthrough. I mean, it sounds like maybe it is in practice, but I mean, I've never gotten a walkthrough of a cloud service provider, but
No.
so okay, well then maybe this research needs to be adjusted slightly.
Yeah.
But for this current position, we've made the assumption that you can take a data center walkthrough, and all that's going to grant you is visual inspection of physical security controls.
And some will, like I've seen, like Terramark, like.
Yeah, Terramark in Virginia will do it. Yeah, I mean there are.
And my experience is particularly with Amazon.
Yeah,
Mine's
yeah,
strictly with
Amazon.
and we're looking at Azure now. So
Yeah, I've gotten Amazon's package through GAO, and you got to go through a lot of hurdles to get it, and then they've got
they
that.
have 2 levels. They have a partner package, and they have a even further additional package that you can get as a federal specific person.
Okay.
Terramark is not really a cloud provider in the same sense as like Amazon, Google, Azure, though, to be fair. They're a hosting provider.
Sure.
So a little different.
Well, this physical thing is probably going to come up again because there's another subset of controls that we capture. But, okay, let me just, it's the next slide. So, these are the bulk control families that we kind of identified as accessible from an end user perspective. It's not complete, but you can see, okay, the physical one, as we just kind of talked about, access control and INA, that's around user accounts. And since you're not going to have full visibility over the admin accounts that the AWS staff have, but you will have an account into Amazon, so you can kind of test some of those things like session lock and like try to put a stupid password in and stuff like that. And then the SC control family, that's around the network communication transmission. And since you are establishing a connection with whoever, the cloud service provider, you are able to kind of look at that connection and evaluate it. Is it encrypted? What level of encryption? These type of things. So I highlighted this, and we'll spend a second talking about it. Now remember, the research was what controls are accessible. We didn't actually assess them, but if you look at it and you say, is this control accessible? Contingency planning controls are accessible in that, do they have an alternate data center? If you bring down their production facility and another one comes up, then that control is in place. So like technically, you can test it from a black box perspective. Should you test it? Probably not, because it's probably not a good idea. And we found 6 controls, 2 completely, 4 partially. And I'll give a couple examples in here, but we called those red team, black team controls that are accessible because you would need to perform, well, on the black team side, I mean, you'd have to like actually attack them. There's a couple other controls that were red team accessible. For example, like maintenance, is it maintenance? I think it's maintenance where there's a control, hey guys, there's a control where, basically tools need to be inspected when they're brought into a facility and no one's allowed to take hardware out of the facility without approval and things like that. Well, technically, assuming that you can get that physical walkthrough or you own a UPS outfit, you could test that control by attempting to bring in something into the facility and see if it gets inspected. Again, your mileage may vary. You might want to have a rules of engagement or kind of set it up, but it is accessible. It's more of a social engineering attack or a physical attack than it is a technical attack. I just got another slide here that kind of drives home the point of the red team and black team. The first bullet, I mean, you could steal someone's laptop, right? A guy comes out or he drops a USB, you could take it from him. Not advised, but you could do it to check that. I already said the inspect tools. And the black team one, you could DOS, like basically what just happened on the Eastern Seaboard. You could do that and see if they were able to maintain uptime during that attack. Again, I wouldn't do it, but you can test it. Okay, so issues. As I mentioned, I used 53A, or we used, I gotta keep saying we used 53A as the catalog for assessment procedures. So if you went beyond that, if you expanded beyond 53A and thought of other kind of innovative ways and approaches to test a control, you might be able to expand the scope of the security controls that are accessible from the end user perspective. I mentioned red and black team. Essentially, you can assess it, but it's probably not a good idea. Internal versus external. So those AC controls and IA controls I mentioned, that's assuming you have, someone's got an admin account that can access the hypervisor level of your AWS instance, right? Well, the Amazon staff, that they're privileged users, their domain accounts and stuff like that, that's managing your environment, you won't have visibility into that. So it is feasible that you've got tight controls on your user accounts, but they have loose controls on theirs. And I keep picking on Amazon. They're probably pretty, you would assume, pretty good because they're such a big animal. But there are 60 or 70 cloud service providers that FedRAMP has approved, and some of them are really tiny. They're niche in what they provide, which is why they're able to be a service offering. But my confidence is less in them. There is in Rev 4 they introduced Appendix J, which is basically the privacy control catalog, and it's a host of controls. But 53A isn't updated yet to include those privacy controls, and I'm not really sure how many of them would really even be end user accessible. But because 53A didn't have them, we excluded them because we were using 53A as kind of our scope of how we were going to do it. So the privacy catalog, as you guys have seen, isn't in there. 853 also, it's a minimum security framework. And there's certain things that when it comes to cloud that you would really be interested in that it just doesn't cover. It doesn't really cover data export in the sense that if you wanted to move from Amazon to Azure, can you get your data out? Is it will they give it to you? Does it come in an exportable format? If you've built out this elaborate infrastructure and VMs and stuff like that, can you get those? There's no control around that, but you could find yourself in effectively an availability position or a concern of availability because you're unable to get your data out of the cloud service provider. And also a breach notification. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I went through 53 last night just to make sure, but as far as I know, there is no control that requires a cloud service provider to make you aware that your data has been breached. Usually this is covered in the contract language.
So the way we've been handling it is that it's an MOA between the agency and the cloud service provider to provide that as part of our IRP.
Yep.
But there's nothing in the agency.
Yeah, there's no minimum security control.
You must do this notification.
Yeah, it's almost standard language in this cloud service agreements at this point, but there's no control, and we're talking about just the minimum security control framework.
The privacy catalog.
Yes, it is. Yeah, if your PII is breached, but I don't think if you have PII in there, it would even fall under that.
If they're still open.
Yeah, I mean, if they were good corporate citizens, they'd let you know. But
There's also only a requirement through contractual agreement whether they're going to notify you if their internal system's been breached without your data being breached. They don't have to notify you of that. We don't have any laws in place that force that. So we have to force an MOA as a federal agency to require them to provide a notification to us within a timely manner that their systems were breached internally so that we can potentially look for any sort of things that bring our hunt teams in and look for any exposure that might be on our systems as well.
yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, it just furthers the point that you have less visibility than you really. It depends on what your risk appetite is, right? I mean, if you got not a lot of important data in there and you've got a huge risk appetite, then go all in on cloud. But so future work, if I was going to continue to do this research, or if someone wanted to pick it up and keep going, like I mentioned before, you could use alternate procedures outside 53A. You certainly wouldn't reduce the number of controls that are in scope for accessibility from the end user perspective, but you could increase them, which would be awesome. Basically, if someone performed the research again, it would give rigor to the research that we did. This I thought was a really interesting one. So I mentioned earlier that third-party organization, they're responsible for assessing the cloud service provider and asserting that those controls are in place. Well, some auditors / assessors are better than others, right? So some may do a poor job of assessing those environments and give them a clean bill of health. So in addition to assessing from the end user perspective, actually doing kind of a look at who the auditors were that performed the work and assessing their competency and credibility, that would be more at a company level. But I think it would give you more confidence in whether or not the controls that they're asserting are in place are actually in place. That's a little bit in a different direction on the research perspective. So.
And that would particularly be applicable to a physical or organizational assessment of a provider.
Yeah.
Where they might have a one-time third-party assessment and then make the results available to potential clients saying, we've been in these elements have been independently assessed. One,
Yeah, and I mean, in order to be listed in FedRAMP, you have to get annual, assessments performed and maintain that ATO that you earned. The thing is, what was I going to say? I don't know what I was going to say, actually. I'm sorry. And it was trash talking the third-party organization, essentially.
Well, I think you have to understand their methodology, the level of rigor that they applied, and be able to evaluate actual artifacts of theirs.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I remember what I was going to say now. So you can, as a federal agency, if you have a .gov email address, effectively, you can request the package, right? So like when that third-party organization does the audit, they put together a package and submit it to FedRAMP. FedRAMP reviews the package and then gives the ATO. You can get that package, so you can have full visibility over those 325 controls the way that they are interpreted to be in scope. So that is additional assurance as to the effectiveness of the control. But the thing is, the research here was supposed to be black box. Like you're completely exposed, you're completely hands off from being able to get that type of documentation. But if you're going to go in, I mean, I would certainly request it.
Is there a validation process? So you've gone through your third-party assessment. Is that work that they've done, is that actually validated by someone? Or could it just be anybody? Could I be a third?
So it's kind of like PCI in that sense, Dennis. It's basically in order to be eligible to perform that audit, you have to get cleared by FedRAMP. So you have to submit paperwork, you have to prove technical competency and industry competency and the ability to do it. And then once you get like FedRAMP certified and you can perform that work, it's like now you can start bidding on that work, and it's almost implicit that if whatever you do is good enough, or it's valid work. So this work, even though it's federal agencies, was the target audience for who could assess this. This type of work can really help anybody that's going to be using cloud services effectively, because what we're talking about is testing these controls from anywhere as a black box environment. So, I don't know how many people are interested in doing that, but if you were the security guy at a small business and you're going to take on cloud, you could do some of these things to kind of give your company peace of mind of their security implementation. Okay, so this is Richard's email address. If you want to contact him, that's my email address, and I'm active on Twitter. And those things I covered at the beginning: DSU, information security, craft beer, and my family. Although let's not talk about my family. Right. If you want to talk about any of those things, please reach out, and I'd be happy to discuss this or my work. And if anyone is really interested in this work, I'd be happy to provide the essentially the workbook underneath the 3,200 line Excel workbook that's got all of our deep dive analysis of like this control is in scope, this one's not in scope, this is why it's not in scope, this is how this assessment procedure would actually be implemented in a technical capability. So. But I mean, that's like a 50 megabyte Excel file, so it's not something you just kind of throw around. But so that's that. So I know that was a lot. I'll open it up if anyone has any questions, or if everybody's just like so blown back by this talk. So any I know we kind of had an ongoing dialogue while it was going, so I don't know if there's any questions. But
so to the best of your knowledge, none of the three-letter organizations have done something like this to assess any of these cloud service providers?
Not that I know of. I would be stunned if the one that I was helping wasn't already doing it, and that they were asking me to do that to validate what they had found, just based on the nature of that particular agency. But yeah, as far as I know, it's like shopping cart. It's like you just go to FedRAMP, you pick some cloud service providers, and you go on. I mean, the reason that it's so appealing to federal agencies is because I care about information security, but like the guy whose program it is, he just cares about the ATO, because it's almost like a checkbox. Right now, the mentality in some instances isn't like, oh, security should be baked into what's going on, and I want to protect my assets. They see security as like, all right, I got to deal with this guy. Like, I just want my ATO. I just come back in 3 years, which that's changed. Now we get annual involvement in the program, but right now the attitude towards information security in a lot of instances is not like, yeah, let's do extra auditing of our cloud service providers. So unfortunately, but we're going that way. It gets better. If you've been in the industry for a while.
I had thought that Amazon had built specifically a data warehouse for the CIA. That's why. And so they may have someone do some assessments, but I don't know the question. They already have some.
They may have. I mean, there's different deployments, right? So there's pure cloud, there's hybrid, there's private cloud. Amazon right now has GovCloud and the public cloud. They're both FISMA compliant, which is, Azure has Amazon has GovCloud and public, but Azure also has GovCloud and public, but both are FISMA compliant. They just went ahead and got them all FISMA compliant. Really, the only difference between those two is that they don't staff non-Americans on the GovCloud side. That's literally the only difference.
Yeah, and ITAR compliance applies.
Yeah, ITAR is really the reason why they do that. But it's completely feasible for an agency to have their own cloud. But then like, what are you doing? Because it's the same as the traditional approach, except instead of the data center being down the street, it's at Amazon.
Well, it's kind of like, they're offloading some of the menial tasks of backing up data and keeping it available.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you get hear most organizations in a legacy world, they're dealing with hardware upgrades, all that stuff, and they don't have to deal with any of that.
Yeah, they just go, we want the actual intelligence. That's what we want.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're dealing with. They don't care about what firmware it's running on.
So as far as like classification, like we were talking about the classified realm, Azure's moved to, they have a CUI level 5 data, which is secret on up. They're one of the only ones that have actually gotten that far. There's a couple small ones as well, but from a major perspective, AWS is not. They're CUI level 4 currently, which is just PII, PHI, sensitive FOUO type data. Once you're to CUI level 5, that's when you start carving secret on up. Azure's the only one who's put something out that's actually been approved for use in CUI level 5 data. It hasn't been deployed on, to my knowledge, yet, but it has been accredited to that level.
Yeah, not to my knowledge either. It's been non-class or unclass up to this point.
Yeah, so we're putting a lot of DHA health information, PII data up there, PII, PHI data. That's where we're actually moving with DHA. They're very heavily pushing to move to the cloud right now.
So having done this analysis,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like you have some opinions about NIST 800. Would you make some particular changes to sort of update it for the new environment, for the cloud-based environment?
Yeah. 53 gets revised every couple years, and I'm a NIST advocate. I don't know if you said it sounds like you have some opinions. I don't know if you meant like positive opinions or negative opinions, but
just for sort of improvement to be more relevant than to the cloud environment than it was.
Yeah.
When it was
Yes, they're working on Rev 5 right now. It's not out for comment yet, but the thing is, the controls need to keep up with technology and the changing environments. And cloud is clearly, not only is it here and being well adopted, but the federal government is mandating it as a first look before you're allowed to do anything else. So I definitely agree. There are some controls in 53 that already address cloud type situations where like there's a control about being physically like the server that you're physically on, how it's not associated with like another one. It's almost like process execution isolation, but on the hardware level. But it's not a required control. So this research is only looking at the moderate baseline, which is basically these 325 controls. 853 probably has 1,000 controls if you count control enhancements as controls in this conversation. So I don't know if it's so much as adding controls as it's adding additional controls to the catalog as it is making certain controls required in certain circumstances. The thing is, they're trying to make it really applicable to every situation, and what they really need to do is they introduced this in Rev 4. They're called overlays, and basically an overlay is your basic control set, and then you overlay, which includes additional controls. So there's an overlay for like space agency. So if you're NASA or anyone doing with space stuff, there's additional controls. If you're working in with PII, there's a privacy overlay. So what they really need is a cloud overlay. I don't have any updates if there's any work on that, but a cloud overlay would certainly go a long way to making the security of it better. I don't know if you'd be able to assess it from an end user perspective, but certainly you could increase the level of assurance that your data is secured. So that's a long answer. Yeah. So
Didn't NIST just release a document covering cloud policy recently too?
they did 800. I want to say it's like 177. It's up there. Do you know what it is? It's 177 or 171.
Yeah, I know they just released that. It's fairly new.
Yeah, and it's guide to like cloud implementation environments.
Like
Yeah. So yeah, even NIST is aware that this is coming, and it's kind of funny how NIST puts out special pubs or guidance. Like sometimes they'll zero in on like a particular topic, like this is how you secure servers, and then sometimes it's generic, like, oh, this is how you secure an environment. You know what I mean? And like servers might be a chapter in there or a section. So I don't know. It's kind of based on the authors. And this is more of an alliance of authors than it is a department within NIST, or you know what I mean? So.
Yeah, and then on the DoD side, you've got the Cloud SRG as well, which is the security requirements guide. It's essentially STIG, if you're not familiar with STIG. Mm-hmm. They have that out for the cloud now. It's still very much a living document currently.
Yeah. How does that work, though? I mean, if it's a STIG, but it's not your environment, how do you STIG it?
So it's more focused on the connection to the cloud. So it's your connection, so what they call a CAP, which is Cloud Access Point.
Yep.
And then the proper instantiation of your systems in the cloud.
Okay.
Infrastructure as a service.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what it focuses more on, but it also talks about how the cloud service provider has to meet these controls.
Okay.
They talk about how it goes to FedRAMP, and there's a lot of stuff in there from a legal standpoint as well.
That's interesting. The one thing that I should remark on is, like, when you go to the cloud, you don't like abstain from implementing controls. Like you as an aid, like, you know, say we're a department, right, and we're going to use the cloud. Like, we all still need to get background security checks. We all need to have the proper access and level of permissions and stuff like that. So controls still have to be implemented. It's just, you know, you're basically outsourcing your IT infrastructure and the controls around that. So at the end of the day, it's really, you lose all visibility when you go to the cloud, and you just have to have the risk appetite for it. So thank you guys for attending. I really appreciate it. This is a good talk.